This video is a continuation of the Unit 3.2 videos on biological molecules. In this video, I'm going to talk about lipids and nucleic acids. So we'll go through the lipids first. We're going to do all the same types of topics as we did for the carbohydrates, starting with monomers. Now, lipids are a really diverse group. There's a lot of different kinds of lipids. But one thing that a lot of lipids have in common is they are made of something called a fatty acid chain. And they also commonly have a group called the glycerol group. So when you made these in class, those glycerols that you built kind of looked like little reindeer, kind of. They had a shape that kind of stuck up like that. That group has the oxygen in it that is common in lipids. And then the fatty acid group was the long chain of carbons hooked together. Sometimes we call these a fatty acid tail. So those two pieces are often put together to make various types of lipids. When we look at those fatty acid tails, we could have saturated or unsaturated versions. And this is something that comes up a lot when people are talking about nutrition. You may have heard about saturated fats or unsaturated fats. Well, when you join carbon molecules together in a fatty acid tail, if those carbons are all joined together by a single bond, that means that that fatty acid tail is going to be nice and straight. However, if any of those carbons are joined by a double bond, that's going to create a little kink in the fatty acid tail. And we see that difference as being fats that are solid at room temperature, like butter, is a saturated fat, and fats that are not solid at room temperature, they're liquid at room temperature, such as different oils, are unsaturated fats. And again, that just refers to the types of bonds that are in those fatty acid tails. Okay, now on to the polymers. So again, I said lipids have a lot of different types of polymers. They're a very diverse group. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them right here. Cholesterol, we've all heard of before. Cholesterol is a lipid polymer, so it's built up of many fatty acids. These fatty acids are in a ring shape, which is a little different, but they're still there. One single free fatty acid looks like this, I wanted to remind you. So if I put 3 of those together, like we did in class, we make something called a triglyceride. And triglycerides are what most of our fats we use for eating are made out of. And then finally, a really important lipid in biology is the phospholipid, because this is the one that's found in the cell membrane. I'll talk about that one a little bit later. But again, it's got those fatty acid tails, and this time it has a phosphate group stuck onto those fatty acid tails. Functions of lipids. Again, because they're a diverse group, they have lots of different functions. Okay, cholesterol can be found in your arteries. Okay, remember I said that was a lipid. Some fats are on your body for insulation, for heat. Also for protection. Just like this cute little seal here. Some fats are found around the cell membranes or make up the cell membranes. As I said, those are your phospholipids. So cell membranes have lipids in them. And then finally, waxes are made out of lipids. So there are waxes like on the leaf surface to help keep the water from being absorbed into the leaf. Also, things like honeybees would make wax using lipids. All right, the next topic, as I said, we're going to cover 2 in this video, is the nucleic acids. Again, starting with a monomer. A monomer, or a building block for nucleic acids, is a nucleotide. And the pretty complicated structure for this is this one right here. It's got 3 parts. It's got a sugar. We'll talk more about this when we talk about nucleotides later on in the year. But it also has a phosphate. And finally, it has a what's called nitrogenous base. And I bet you can guess why it's called a nitrogenous base. If you look really carefully at the structure, it's got some nitrogen in it. All right, so those different nitrogenous bases that can go into a nucleotide are cytosine, thymine, adenine, and guanine, And then this last one, which for some reason didn't come out quite right, is a uracil, or a U. Now these letters, A, G, C, and T, and U, should sound kind of familiar to you. These are letters that you learned about back in biology, and the reason for this has to do with the polymer for nucleic acids, which we'll get to in a minute. So again, the monomer for nucleic acid is a nucleotide. The nucleotide has 3 parts, a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogenous base, and there are 5 different types of nitrogenous bases that we find in nucleotides. Now here's maybe where you remember those letters, the A's and T's, C's and G's, the polymers of nucleotides. So when you put a bunch of nucleotides together are RNA and DNA. And if you remember, the A's or the adenines always pair with the T's or the thymines. The guanines always pair with the cytosines. And the difference between the DNA and the RNA, remember, is that RNA has that uracil, which takes the place of the thymine. Again, we'll get into more detail on this later, but the important part is remembering there are 2 different polymers for nucleic acids. So when you put a bunch of nucleotides together, a bunch of A's and T's and G's and C's, you can make RNA or DNA. In the case of RNA, you need U's. The last thing we always cover with these molecules is their functions. And with nucleic acids, it's pretty straightforward. They are the information storage for the cell. So all of the information that tells your cell what to do is stored in the RNA and then ultimately, or the DNA, and then ultimately gets transferred to the RNA. We don't spend a whole lot of time on nucleic acids in this section of college biology because we'll do a whole unit on DNA and RNA later on.